A warm welcome to you all too, in the room here and also joining us online. I'm Peter Konoski, the Professor of Forestry here in the Fenner School. I'm your host, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay respects to their elders past and present. You can see a picture on the screen behind me of Jack Westoby giving a lecture in Australia in, I believe, 1969. The first Westoby lecturer, 13 lectures ago, Dennis Cullity, had invited Jack to speak at an Australian conference because he'd heard Jack, and I quote from his original lecture, give a riveting presentation on the trade in wood-based panels. So that's a hard act to follow, of course, David. Jack was at the time director of FAO, UN Food and Agriculture Organization Forestry Department, a role from which he exercised considerable contemporary influence and a great legacy subsequent to his death in 1988 on how we understand forestry internationally. That's a legacy that still continues, and as all my students, some of whom are in the room know, I frame my teaching about forestry with a quote from Jack Westoby. Forestry is not about trees, it's about people, and it's about trees only insofar as they can serve the needs of people. We're very fortunate to have with us, as usual for these lectures, Emeritus Professor Mark Westoby, Jack's son, himself a distinguished academic, and it's through the generosity of Mark and his family, catalysed by Jack's colleague and friend, the late Alf Leslie, an Australian forester, that we've come to host the Westoby lecture here at ANU. So I'd like to invite Mark to say a few words about his father. Thanks, Mark. Welcome.
Thanks, guys. Really nice of you to come, and I love this event. Thanks for the chance to tell you a bit about my father. I'm intensely proud of him. He was born in 1912. His father and several brothers and relatives were railwaymen in Yorkshire. His mother was from a mine worker family and in domestic service before he married. On both sides, their ancestors 2 generations before that, in about 1850s, 1860s, had moved from being farm workers in the Midlands to the mines or the railway, looking for pay and independence. So the whole family really was a microcosm of the Industrial Revolution, the freedom that it brought and the benefits that it brought. Jack won scholarships for school and university, did a degree at what was then, Hull University College. It was a pretty poorly graded degree. He was into social and political life more than into studying things. His outlook was, he was a leftist. His outlook was shaped by the Great Strike of 1926, by the Depression years, by fascism, by the Spanish Civil War. His outlook was internationalist, as was true of most of the left in those years. So he emerged into the Depression years and unemployment and became a clerk on the railways, since you had to do something. And through the Second World War, he stayed with the railways, partly because of heart murmur, and partly because apparently his skill in redirecting trains when railway lines had been bombed is a reserved occupation of strategic importance. And he and my mother, Flo, conceived their first child, my older brother, Adam, after Stalingrad, once it was clear that Hitler would be defeated. So Jack was released from the so-called Essential Works Order in 1945 and entered a public service exam, which is what he did, and was appointed to the Board of Trade. And there were 4 of them. And between the 4 of them, they were responsible for keeping trade and industry statistics about the whole economy. And his quarter of the economy included timber and pulp and paper production and trade. So that's how he came to forestry, not by being outdoorsy or by knowing anything about how to grow trees, but by trade statistics and things. And then the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN established a forestry division. And the first thing they set out to do was to make forecasts of future demand for wood and pulp products. They recruited Jack in 1952 to headquarters in Geneva and moved there. And in 1958, the headquarters moved to Rome. He stayed with FAO through to retirement in the 1970s, and he continued consulting and writing and speech giving after that. In the 1980s, he developed motor neurone disease, died 3 years later. It was while he was on his back with MND that his 2 books were completed, and I remember sort of close pinning draft pages or sort of clothesline running across his head in bed so he could read and give editing instructions. And it's the royalties from those books via the good offices of Alf Leslie, who Peter mentioned, that support this memorial lecture. So through his 20-some years with FAO, where his influence came from, most of the work consists of negotiating projects in developing countries, projects for forestry-based industries, forest R&D, for forestry education. And those negotiations have lots of players. The government of the country in question, obviously, its land management agencies, financing bodies like the World Bank, aid agencies from developed countries, people actually living on the lands in question, commercial interests of various sorts. And so FAO is trying to coordinate and persuade, and in parallel to articulate policy about, okay, what's a good project, what's a bad project, and why. And Jack got to know lots of foresters in the traditional tree growing sense, and to like and respect most of them. His outlook on forest projects was always political, by which I mean that he saw them as being about people, the quote Peter gave, people, and about poverty, and about power, and who benefits. And his views evolved over time and in light of experience. And by the time of the 1978 World Forestry Congress, he was saying openly that the interests of governments were often opposed to the best interests of their people. He was the intellectual livewire, I think, within the FAO Forestry Division, and more widely. But despite what you said, Peter, he was actually never acceptable as director. And that probably tells you why they found him, I forget the exact title, but a sort of freelancing position. In some defense of FAO, the United Nations is actually a consortium of governments. So it's kind of compelled to pretend that governments do represent their people's interests and proceed in that way. So they didn't, though they didn't make him director, they didn't kick him out either. So fair enough. I don't agree with everything that Jack said or wrote, but there's no doubt he made me who I am. Argument around ideas was dinner time activity routinely in our house. We grew up to believe that ideas were important, that they had the potential to change the world. It's nearly 40 years since he died, but week by week, I'm still asking myself what he would think about things.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mark. It's inspiring to hear on how we came to be here honouring Jack Westoby. And I'm sorry that my copy of his book is still in my desk in my office, that I haven't made it to today for various reasons. But picking up from your explanation of your father's interests, I'll come in a moment to introduce David and the connection of his subject area to Jack's interests. But before introducing David, just like to recognise a number of those present. Amongst my many ANU colleagues and our students, Professor Steve Eggins, who's Dean of the new College of Systems and Society that we're part of. Steve, thanks for being here. Professor Karen Kirk, Dean of the College of Science and Medicine that we were part of. Thanks, Karen, for being here. Steve's in the white shirt, Karen's in the black shirt, and the red shirt, Professor Saul Cunningham, Director of the Fenner School. Thank you for coming back from Japan to be here too, Saul. And for a number of those outside of ANU, just to recognise a few of you, Professor Daniela Kleinschmidt, who's President of the International Union of Forest Research Organisations and a Westoby lecturer in 2020, as COVID was breaking over us. Professor Bill Jackson, President of Forestry Australia. Nora DeVoe, ACR Forestry Program Manager. I'm not sure if Dana Hallam from the Forest Products. Dana, g'day, welcome. CEO of Forest Products, Australian Forest Products Association. And then Adrian Cloden and Rob Hescock, who are donors of awards for our students. Thank you. And to all other colleagues from the federal and ACT governments, partner universities and CSIRO, welcome. To David Brand, just as Jack Westoby did, David has and is making a significant contribution to forestry globally. He's done that in a number of ways over his career, firstly in senior roles in government in Canada and Australia, then in the private sector, where he led the development globally of ecosystem service markets associated with forests, turning that elegant concept into a financial reality, something that many of us aspire to, but few have realised so successfully. And it's that topic that's the subject of his Westoby lecture, and note the resonance with a focus on forestry as an asset with Jack Westoby's origins as an economist. Since stepping down as CEO of New Forests, the firm that he established, David's taken on chairing the International Sustainable Forestry Coalition, a group of private forestry companies dedicated to supporting transition to a nature-positive bioeconomy. And he's also a generous donor and sponsor of education, with a chair that he's endowed in innovation in the forestry sector at his alma mater, UBC. So please join me in welcoming the 2025 Westoby lecturer, Dr. David Brand, and I'll pull up his slides momentarily. David, welcome.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Peter, and thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here and honor your father and his legacy in the forestry sector. And thanks to all of you coming, quite a royalty of the forestry sector here today. So what I'll try and talk about in 30, 35 minutes, whatever it takes, is kind of how the investment world sees forestry and why I think there's an opportunity for forestry to play a bigger role in society, and how do we seize those opportunities. So I'll start just a quick introduction of New Forests. You know, I started the company in 2005. I'm not a businessman. I mean, I have a PhD in ecophysiology, but I formed the view at some point that if we're going to change the world, we have to change how capital is deployed and what it's invested in. And so really in the middle of my career, I went from science and public policy into investment management, and we built New Forest from scratch. Today we manage, I think, over $12 billion in assets across 4.3 million hectares. That's an area the size of Switzerland. And, you know, we have offices now in United States, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Nairobi, and have just steadily built the business over now almost 20 years to be a successful investment business, and I think a market-leading investment business. We've never had a year of negative returns, and you know, there's not a lot of asset classes that went through the global financial crisis and the pandemic and just kept producing good positive returns. That's what trees do. They just keep growing. So, but anyway, we've always had this aspiration to have an investment strategy that's kind of led by sustainability. We always have a home in the forestry sector, but we've tried to always be innovators and looking at ways that we could generate higher returns by being on the right side of trends and opportunities. So as Peter said, 2 years ago, I sold the business to Mitsui and Nomura, the two Japanese giants, and they are, I think, more capable than me of driving the next phase of growth of the company. And so what I've taken on now part-time is to be the chair of this new International Sustainable Forestry Coalition, which is currently 15 companies, about to be 16, I think, next month, and managing across something like 39 different countries, forestry assets. And collectively, we see the opportunity kind of in two buckets. The one is really moving forestry into a natural capital asset class where it's reconceptualized by investors. And secondly is supporting the transition to a circular bioeconomy. And as a couple of our members have said, Stora Enso, UPM, Kimini, anything you make out of fossil fuels, you can make out of a tree. And that's kind of one of our aspirations, is to systematically look at how we can grow the forestry sector to substitute for some of those more environmentally damaging materials. Okay, so forestry, it's a small asset class. I think the investable universe of forestry is considered to be about $400 billion worldwide. Compare that to commercial and residential real estate in Australia is probably $11 trillion. So we're like a speck of dust, but we're my speck of dust. And people have recognized that forestry plays an important role in a diversified portfolio of investment. And partly that's because it has a very stable return profile. And the tree grows, it's a capital appreciation, it becomes more valuable. When the tree's cut and sold, income is generated. And so you have those two components of return. And every year we look at our capital asset value and our income, and that's our total return. Because a lot of the return from forests comes from growth, there's no inherent correlation with other markets. And so what you end up with is often a low to negative correlation between forestry investments with other types of stocks and bonds and so on. And so when you build a portfolio for, say, a large pension fund, they're modeling hundreds of asset classes and trying to get the optimal, what they call risk-efficient frontier. So if they want to try and get 8% with a 15% volatility, they're trying to find what are the right mix of assets. And inevitably, they want more forestry than we can give them because it's such a small asset class. But it's also seen as inflation hedging. So long-term correlation with inflation has been positive. It's another defensive characteristic of forestry that attracted the investors, and the low volatility. So those are very conventional considerations of forestry in a timber-dominated market and so on. But what's emerging now over the last, I would say, 5-6 years has been a rethinking of the potential purpose of forestry in an institutional investment portfolio. So not only now are people thinking about risk and return, but they're making commitments to decarbonize their investment portfolio in alignment with the Paris Agreement. So what do you have to do to change that mix of assets that starts to give you a decarbonization pathway? And lo and behold, a lot of the land use sector has proven to be potential for contributing to that. Secondly, people are saying, well, now we also want to be nature positive. And, with the global biodiversity framework, there's an aspiration of 30% protected area. A lot of that's going to have to come from privately owned land as well as government-owned land. And so investors are starting to ask, what are the metrics that I need to be following in order to understand if I'm having a positive or negative impact on biodiversity? So what you start to see then is modeling that not only looks at the optimal risk-efficient frontier, but then they say, what is the optimal risk-efficient frontier in a decarbonizing portfolio? And ultimately, even some now will be saying, and in a nature-positive portfolio. And so you start to see some of the early examples of that as being done by organizations like Nuveen, who are actually figuring out what they would need to do in terms of a decarbonizing portfolio. So this is an exciting area which is driving a lot of new, fresh interest in our sector. Forestry, is central to so many of the sustainability transitions, because everything that we do over the next 100 years, as we get to a peak of 10 billion people and probably a $300 trillion gross world product, sustainability has to become central, despite, some of the short-term political situation we're seeing with Trump and so on. But we have to make an energy transition where we have to move from fossil fuels to clean energy. The forestry sector is increasingly seen as potential for wind farms, solar farms, sustainable bioenergy, and even hydroelectric developments. We need a transportation transition, moving away from internal combustion engines, but also finding sustainable shipping and aviation fuels. And again, for example, one of our member companies has just opened a major biofuel plant in Germany for sustainable aviation fuels. We need a materials transition where we move away from linear materials, where we use them and throw them away, to things that can be reused, repurposed, recycled, and then ultimately naturally decomposing. That's what forestry and biomass and wood fiber does. We need to change our built environment and make a sustainable built environment. And the forestry sector can provide these new advanced wood building systems that have a carbon positive built environment. There's been a lot of discussion with the G20 next year about the massive urbanization of Africa and how do we do that in a sustainable way? How do we have more of a biomass-based built environment? And then lastly, of course, the land use transition and creating a biosphere that's both carbon and nature positive. And the forestry sector operating at scale can integrate into landscape solutions around climate mitigation and adaptation, conservation measures, and creating sustainable rural economy. So that's a huge set of opportunities for our sector, which we, I think, are beginning to try and understand how to seize. So let's start with this bioeconomy concept. And, I think when we look at the current sources of biomass, about, I think 19 billion tons is coming out of agriculture, about 4 billion tons out of forestry, and about 100 million tons of aquatic fisheries. That goes into about 17 billion tons of food and beverages and animal feed, and about 4 billion tons goes into materials, and about 2 billion into energy. And forestry, that 4 billion tons is about 2 billion tons of what we call industrial roundwood. It's going into use in society. The other 2 billion is basically firewood, subsistence firewood. The opportunity is this whole host of opportunities, cellulosic fabrics. I heard a paper that all incremental fabrics in society will be cellulosic. Bio-based packaging, moving away from plastic-based packaging to more naturally recyclable and decomposable materials, new engineered wood materials and multi-story wood construction systems, biochemicals, bioplastics that will replace petrochemicals, and biomass energy and fuels. And all of these are tremendous opportunities, but the scale of them is also daunting because our little forestry sector, producing 2 billion tons of roundwood, when you look at that substitution and some of the studies that have been done, we may need to increase production fourfold by 2050 if we were to really make a dent in these fossil fuels and move onto a more bioeconomy-based system. Well, that's not going to happen easily. And the source of our wood supply is about 1 billion tons a year comes out of semi-natural forests, and about 1 billion tons a year comes out of intensively managed timber plantations. All incremental supply will come out of the intensively managed timber plantations. But we're not going to be able to plant 50 million hectares of new plantations on Earth because there's just too much pushback from the farming community. There's too much difficulty in land use change, and the economics are difficult. So we probably need almost a cascade of intersecting policy elements. The first is to push harder on recycling and reuse of materials. Let's say we could increase that by 1/4 to get into a more circular economy. Secondly, looking at 100% utilization of every tree that we harvest so that we have building materials, fiber-based materials, and then a last residual of biomass-based materials, almost like processing ecosystems that could probably increase supply by another 25%. Then we need to take the production systems that we already have and properly capitalize them and make them as productive as possible. And that can probably double production in many areas. And then lastly, some expansion onto degraded or marginal agriculture land. And if you take another, say, 25% of that, so you could probably see your way 25% times 25% times 100% times 25%, you'd get to about a quadrupling. And so that's the kind of thinking that you would need in terms of how would you get to that scale of substitution at a kind of international level. And we're trying to do that in practice. So we bought a couple of pine plantations, one in South Australia. It was formerly known as Oz pine. And then we bought the Taswood plantations in Tasmania, 45,000 hectares each. We bought the sawmills that process the wood from each of those. We've invested tens of millions of dollars into each mill to dramatically increase the total production and make us as efficient as possible. I said to them, I want you bottom quartile of your cost of production, And then what you could do is you start to layer on a value-added strategy. At Tarpina, we have a cross-laminated timber, glue-laminated timber plant that's the size of 4 football pitches that makes these huge 16-meter panels you can crane into like multi-story buildings. In Tasmania, we're mopping up a lot of the plastic waste in Tasmania. We grind it up with the sawdust and waste out of the mill, and then we heat it up and extrude a termite-resistant decking product that sells for $1,500 a ton or $15 a cubic meter out of garbage. And so you can sort of see how you create like a processing ecosystem that creates a whole utilization of the tree and generates a huge amount of increased value. And then the land itself, I think is being almost reinvented in terms of how we're thinking about land use investment. It's kind of like what Macquarie Bank did with airports, where you'd buy an airport, it would be the net present value of the landing fees of the different airlines that use the airport. But then they figured out, oh, we can add a shopping mall and a conference center and a hotel and another parking lot. And all of a sudden they quadrupled the value of these assets. And guess what? In forestry, we've got food, fiber, timber, climate finance, biodiversity finance. We can put solar farms in degraded areas. We can put up wind farms, water rights. And all of a sudden, that's the same thing happening in forestry, that we're getting a huge increase in the value of these assets and a huge amount of diversification in terms of the market exposures that we're able to develop return from. Just looking at one of these, the example of climate solutions is huge. Some of our assets have doubled in value from being exposed to a carbon price signal. And when you look at the world, land is going to be a huge part of the solution to decarbonization. Something like 4 gigatons of emissions can be removed by stopping deforestation and degradation of natural ecosystems. Something like 5 gigatons can be reduced and removed through improved management of forestry and agriculture lands. And something like 2 gigatons per annum can be removed through restoration of degraded land. So collectively, that's 11 billion tons of emissions on a swing, with the annual emissions of the world being something like 44 billion. So, you're not going to solve climate change and get to net zero unless land use is on the central stage here. And I think that's been one of our frustrations, is we're often treated as a sideshow. We as an investor are exposed to multiple carbon price signals. California, there's $30 a ton. A lot of it's for extending forestry rotations, putting marginal stands into conservation management. New Zealand, it's about reforestation of marginal agriculture land, price around 35 US a ton. The Australian Emission Reduction Fund is being used by our investments to do extending of rotations, say from short rotation to long rotation, and reforestation of new areas. And then, in our Asian business and African businesses, we're doing a lot of the voluntary market deals. So we're doing a huge peatland restoration deal in Thailand, and we're doing some restoration projects in Africa and so on. And those are all kind of embedded within the forestry investment strategies that we're pursuing in those regions. So how does, just taking carbon as an example, your normal forest management model is you say, okay, what is my optimal investment in harvesting, silviculture, and protection? And you run these linear programming models like Woodstock, or I forget the other one's name, Firefly or something. And then you say, but there's also a carbon price signal. So it's not just about optimizing timber. And so we built this system in the United States where we could start to try to run models that would give us the optimal allocation of forestry against a given projected carbon price path and timber price path. And what we've debated, like at our investment committee, is, well, carbon price is a lot more volatile than the timber price. Maybe we should have a higher discount rate. It's more likely to be influenced by public policy. So we had to go through that debate. And, I think we've had some really interesting lessons from now 15 years of carbon pricing, particularly in New Zealand, where the price of carbon went to $95 a ton, Kiwi dollars. But that's almost like an experiment. Like, what would happen if you had a carbon price signal of $95 a ton to land use? And well, guess what? The marginal sheep grazing country that was worth $2,500 a hectare became worth $17,000 a hectare because the carbon value got capitalized into the land. And it just demonstrates how quickly you can make nature valuable by creating a price signal. And we see this over and over again, you know, and there's an economic margin phenomenon. So as these prices of ecological values increase, land flips into more the purpose of climate solutions or nature conservation because it becomes a higher return. And we operate in a, you know, a very rational world of having to pay people's pensions or backup insurance pools and so on. And so that's really how we operate. And but it is complicated, and all the different markets have different rules, and they're not fungible. And so you have a lot of complexity in terms of trying to navigate all this, and governments change and they change the rules. And so it's been problematic in terms of being able to bank some of these price signals and generate the returns over time. But the fundamental model here, this is a bridge diagram, we call it, is you start with an investment, and let's say we pay $60 million for 20,000 hectares of forestry and agriculture land. And let's say that then would be worth 60 million under a normal management regime, producing cattle or wheat or timber. But let's say there's a carbon price signal. We say, okay, we're going to move some of that area into more restoration or conservation, and we'll have now a net present value of a carbon price signal. So now I've gone from 60 million to 30 plus 40. So I've gained $10 million by repositioning how I manage those assets. And then I might have a water quality payment or a biodiversity price signals like our new nature repair market. And that might add another 25 million because I can now restore commercially riparian zones and areas that are not productive for agriculture. And I might have my tradable water rights that I can lease to a downstream irrigator. And I might be able to lease a hill line or ridge line for wind farms. And the next thing, you know, I'm up to now 60 million of gain through adding those additional sources of option value. And that's how everybody is thinking about it these days, is how you can drive that revaluation, repricing of the land and nature through these new opportunities. That's driving, you know, probably a revolution in analytical tools. You know, I was talking to these guys in Melbourne who they were asked to model the Australian wheat crop once a month. And the idea was that the Australian government wanted to know, like, what does our wheat crop look like? We need to know how much wheat we're going to have to sell, how much capacity in the ports and all the grain silos and so on. So the more early information they can get, the better. I said, well, that's interesting. And they said, you know, how do you do that? And they said, we make these geospatial maps. I said, oh, really? And like, can you see like which farms are better than others? And oh yeah, and can you see like which parts of farms are making money and which, oh yeah, that's quite transparent. And I said, do you realize how valuable that is? Because now we realize there was an unknown inefficiency that something like 20% of farmland doesn't make any money. And all of a sudden that's a huge opportunity because we can reposition that at next to no cost into some of these ecological and environmental solutions. And so that's now what's happening is this landscape scale analytical work and spatial heat mapping that is helping us to understand what the options are in terms of reorganizing landscapes to drive more value creation. And, you know, I'm not an AI guy, but I've been talking to a few people lately who are talking about this emerging concept of agentic AI, where you have agents that can look at, you know, forestry productivity, farmland productivity, carbon value, biodiversity values, and so on, depending on the metrics. And then they can be rolled together into a rationalizing AI that then starts to give you a continuous optimization of how land would be used against these various price signals. And, you know, there's just a huge amount of value to be unlocked in terms of getting these tools to much more efficiently use landscapes. And if you think about Australia, where we have huge areas of hundreds of millions of hectares of land with only 26 million people, I mean, we could be a superpower at this type of stuff. This is an example in the US where we created a heat mapping tool that took the California AB 32 carbon market rules, and we basically applied that to the forests in the Pacific Northwest to create a heat map that showed us where there was unrealized climate mitigation value in forests. We then bought those for the net present value of their forestry cash flows and re-optimized them between timber and carbon. And we added something like 200 to 400 basis points of excess return for our clients. And that's just straight up, you know, analytical extraction of value from this landscape that was otherwise not recognized. So what's happening then from all this? You know, I think we're seeing an integration of investment into forestry, agriculture, conservation. Operating these silos is probably inefficient. And, you know, our new fund, I'll talk about it in a minute, is called a landscape investment fund that can look across the whole sources of value. You know, we need to be able to understand these new sources of market opportunity. We may have variegated investment models. You may go from just trying to buy big chunks of forest or land, and you might have a core and then hub, like in, you know, in Laos, we have outgrower schemes with local farmers are growing some of the trees for us. Tasmania, we have a program called Active Acre where we try to encourage farmers to dedicate part of their properties into forestry that could be a higher return for them. You know, Africa, we have a agroforestry outgrower type of program. So all of these kind of more variegated models allow us to, you know, to deploy more capital without necessarily having to just buy farms out, which is often the source of, you know, sort of public consternation. It also drives different fund structures. We used to have a classic, you know, 10+2 fund life where you'd buy assets, hold them for 10 years and then sell them. Now we're moving more to open-ended funds where you can deploy capital and then just work these sources of option value over decades. Blended finance, where we're bringing in different types of investors with different aspirations. Our fund in Southeast Asia has, you know, a component which has it's about $50 million that requires a lower return, but forces the whole fund to have a higher conservation and climate mitigation benefits associated with it. So it's like a win-win for both types of investors. You know, renewable energy development, offtakes, and natural capital value, and so on. All of that is central now to the type of work we're doing. So this is, you know, kind of our new fund in Australia. We call it a landscape fund. We're allowed to invest across forestry, agriculture, and conservation. We can also add circular bioeconomy processing options if that will unlock value. The fund is open-ended and can have rolling extensions. It allows us to do a lot more granular allocation of land and moving land to its highest use. And we can integrate supply chains and increase margins. And basically, we have a lot more tools to drive asset value and return for our clients. So this is kind of a picture, a little diagram of, say, inland New South Wales, one of our catchments. And, you know, the current situation here, you know, we have a river valley, and in the back country, we'll have, you know, sort of dry land, sheep and cattle grazing, not generating an awful lot of revenue. As you move down the slopes, you get more of like a dry land agriculture, like wheat and canola, oats, barley. And then the real value comes out of the irrigated agriculture down on the lower slopes and flats. And when you look at that, 70% of that revenue is coming out of that high value irrigated agriculture, but the system has low biodiversity, low carbon stock, it's got water quality issues. If we tried to re-engineer that with investment capital, and if we had the right option value sources around carbon, water, biodiversity, and so on, then we can start to see, we start restoring areas of these farms that aren't making a lot of profit. We start to restore some of the riparian zones. We put in things like wind farms and solar farms. We put some forestry in the backcountry. We put in something like a biochar plant that can improve agricultural productivity. And, you know, you start to get a landscape that not only has a bigger economy, it has a more diverse economy, but it also becomes more sustainable. It has now restored a lot of the biodiversity. It's got a lot more capability in terms of nutrient retention. It's got improved water quality. And so the whole system in some ways can be lifted up. And investors like that because from an investor's point of view, that's generating more value and more higher return. So that's kind of the central model that we're trying to pursue with our new fund here in Australia. So when you bring together like our International Forestry Coalition, you know, we're trying to work with investors to reconceptualize forestry and agriculture as a natural capital asset class that has a different purpose than just risk and return in a portfolio. That's driving us because we need to standardize things like carbon accounting, things like biodiversity metrics. We need to think about even social benefit metrics associated with how we're investing. And that allows then investors to start to put a portfolio together because there's a consistent architecture to how this natural capital asset class is being quantified and characterized. And if you do that, then potentially, and in fact, probably, we'll see the asset class expand because now, like, for example, we're doing a giant project restoring wetlands in Thailand. Well, we wouldn't have been able to do that within a forestry fund, you know, 5 years ago. And what's happening is like the forestry, the concept of what forestry and agriculture and land use is expanding in the eyes of investors. And so that will allow us to deploy a lot more capital to start to do more in, say, emerging markets than we've done in the past. Because, you know, when you think about the tropics, that's where biodiversity and carbon stocks and so on are most critical. And that's where we've had a paucity of ability to deploy capital. So that's, you know, really what we're trying to work on collectively is to build that new natural capital asset class. So I guess just to conclude, you know, we see this as opportunities for investors, but there's of course, obviously risks as well as we go through a changing climate. And we need to, you know, be cognizant of physical risks as well as opportunities. But our view is we can manage some of the most of the physical risk. We just need to look at ways that we can build large diversified portfolios that don't give you a very acute exposure to any one risk factor. We need to be much more granular in our decision making and our allocation of land use. We need more sophisticated analytical tools to support that. And, you know, we need to be cognizant that transitions are difficult and you have to take people with you. And, you know, often even with our investors, they don't like transitions. They say, Dave, I don't like a transition because it's got no track record. But they also understand that, you know, doing what we're doing now is not really going to take us where we need to get to. And, you know, if we can get this right, build this new model, then I think we can potentially get to the scale where we can make significant impacts on climate, nature conservation, community benefits, and the transitions we need in the built environment, materials, energy, and land use. So thank you.
Thanks very much, David. That was a sort of different play on the theme that Jack Westoby spoke to of forestry not being about trees, but about people and what they're willing to invest in. So yeah. Thank you. We've got time for some questions or comments, 10 minutes or so, then we'll go out and have a drink and continue the conversation outside. Andrew Campbell has the microphone. He's up here behind you, Giselle, just over there.
Thanks very much.
Try this one.
Okay. Thanks very much, David. That was a fabulous lecture. A dumb question, maybe, but in a particular region or a particular landscape, what happens when you get a massive fire and all your various asset classes are vaporized?
That happened to you recently?
Yeah, very nearly, Peter.
So you have really three or four things that you'd use to manage this. The first is diversification. It's the only free lunch. So if you're an investor and you put all of your eggs in Northern California, you're taking a very high risk. So you'll have nothing happen, and then you'll have a huge fire year, and you'll take a big loss. But if you're diversified across 5 continents and 50 million, hectares of land, you're going to approach the long-term average loss rate, which is predictable and priceable. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you can transfer the risk. So in many cases, we use either direct fire insurance, or we use these new products that are called parametrics, that you get paid out if certain climatic events occur, even if you don't have losses. And the third is you can better manage these risks. And so when you look at things like automating fire detection through these new smoke detectors, when you look at initial attack, we're the second largest landowner in Northern California, or in California. And so we have dip pits everywhere for helicopters to get access to water wherever, a fire might start. And then the last thing is you can avoid it, and you can decide, no, that's like simply too hard to go there. And across that, we've been able to manage, the changing fire risk across our portfolio.
Can I come? I just come down to Ross first, and then you've got 2 microphones, one for people in the room, and one for people who aren't in the room. Ross, you're talking both simultaneously. It's a test. Don't worry too much there as well.
Is it working?
Yeah, it'll work enough.
Okay. So we've talked about fires. Floods is another opportunity for you, I think. We are doing a lot of work at the moment on nature-based solutions to flooding, and we're currently reviewing the quantitative impact of forest planting on flood mitigation, and there is definitely something there that you can consider, as well as water quality. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I think the whole area of hydrology, flow duration, sedimentation, nutrient loss or salinity, that whole basket, really has been under utilized. And I guess that's one of our, certainly some of the companies that are in our coalition, water is a very big issue to them. Even in the Japanese guys were telling me that they have huge oyster beds off of the coast of their forests, and how they manage the forest is quite important to the productivity of the oyster beds, because otherwise they get like iron leakage and so on. And so there's a whole series of things that are almost again, option value that hasn't been exploited yet.
Thanks, David. My name is Keith Barney from the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU here. And with Peter, I've spent quite a bit of time around in Laos, including in some of the areas where New Forest has some plantations there. So my question is, well, thank you for the presentation, basically, which helps explain, in my mind, a lot of the ideas around New Forest, I suppose. My question is, why would a traditional forestry company not be able to do the things that you're doing in New Forest? Why does one need New Forest framed as sort of a financialized fund, asset management fund, as opposed to simply a traditional forestry company like Weyerhaeuser or some company that basically is doing the same thing?
Well, they're right on it. They've set up a whole natural climate solutions division. This year they're proposing they're going to reach 100 million in EBIT from natural climate solutions revenues. I was reading the analyst report on Weyerhaeuser last week, and they're now making them a buy because of some of the excess returns that they're able to generate from things like wetland banks, climate solutions, and so on in that division. So it's actually bubbling up to the level where analysts are thinking about who has these sources of option value.
Invest in warehouse. Definitely, I think, go across
Did you go first here?
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
he
so
was-
Rob first.
I
is that
saw,
right?
I saw
Okay.
him first,
Right.
sorry.
It's up, Deputy, you can be-
I don't want to take Deppy's
Yeah.
place. Actually, I asked, Rod Keenan, associated with the University of Melbourne. I'll ask the question I thought Keith was going to ask, which, because at the beginning, Mark referred to Jack Westoby's interest in forestry for people, and that a lot of it's about poverty, power, and who benefits. And you mentioned briefly benefit sharing, as a critical part of this, but what does a genuine benefit and power sharing arrangement look like for many of these lands that you're talking about
Yeah.
that are largely going to be poor people in rural landscapes?
So, I think I'm going to just start with the example of Guns, who is a company that was operating in Tasmania. They paid their contractors on 90-day terms. They stripped money relentlessly out of their assets in a kind of a strange, like a hunt the white whale pulp mill project. And they ran everything down. Everything was miscapitalized. They were over leveraged. So we bought them out. And the first thing I said, everybody gets paid on time. And so every family contractor business, every person in the supply chain got paid on time. As soon as they all got paid on time, guess what happened? They became bankable. And they said, hey, if we buy this new Swedish equipment, we could shave $5 a ton off the cost. Will you give us a 5-year contract? Yeah, that's a deal. And so we started getting our cost structure coming down. They started to get confidence in their business. Their kids went into the business and stayed in the business and didn't go out to Western Australia. And all of a sudden there was a footy team, in the community again. And I think that's kind of the first and foremost thing, is bringing that confidence into the whole supply chain by being a stable and reliable source of, support for everybody's business. The other thing, for me is you have different players that have different ability to accept risk. So if I'm a farmer and I've got, 30% of my property is not making me any money, I don't really have the ability to go and pay $2,000 a hectare and plant that up with pine and wait 30 years to get a return. But I can. And so I can say, I'll take that land and I'll give you $400 a hectare or whatever it is as a 30-year lease, and I'll grow the trees. Now you got an income every year, and that's more aligned with your risk profile as a farmer. So that's how you have to think about creating systems where everybody wins.
Actually, that was my question, but I have a plan B if someone else asks that question. Following up on your comment, have you experienced something like when you're creating the social safety net or safeguard mechanism in your, investment, like have you experienced maybe failure in that, like resistance from the people, they kind of doesn't want to be part of your project. So what sort of, and then how you actually factor into your projection, like investment projection, because all what I can see here now is all like good stories, I would say, and then we should be positive, but then maybe, you can tell us some your experience as well. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think, you saw in New Zealand where the carbon price went so high, everybody was just like buying all the farmland and planting trees on it. And in some ways it's like ironic because the farmers like thumped the table and said, you will not, we'll not have any carbon price that we have to pay, make other people deal with it. And so the forestry sector dealt with it and bought their land and planted trees. So, there was a whole movement in New Zealand called Shades of Green, or what was that book about Shades of Gray or something? Anyway, they had this movement against forestry. I think that's sort of tempered now because the prices come back down to about $50. But like in Laos, where we have the outgrower scheme, the problem for a lot of those farmers is they only make, say, $2,000 a year income. So if you grow them 1 or 2 hectares of trees that are worth, say, $5,000 a hectare each, that can be like their pension fund, or that's their year of the crop failure fund or whatever. And because what we do is we give them the same trees to grow as we grow. We provide the seedlings, they grow the trees. And then when they want to sell the trees, we give them the same market price that we would get. So, it's a great way to try and get the community aligned with us. And it also benefits us in that we have more than wood that we can process in our lathes and in our sawmill.
Speaking of Laos, segue to soy from Laos. There, and we're going to work our way to the back of the room, a bit like most forestry lectures in my recollection. All the questions will be down the front, not many from up the back. So by the time we get up the back, we'll finish and have time to go out for a drink. Soy.
Okay, thank you very much, David. My name is Soitawan. I'm independent research consultant in Laos. And so listen to your presentation and the model. I really hope that it will happen in Laos. And I really want smallholder in Laos can benefit from this model. But my concern, based on my experience working in Laos and interview farmer, one question I will ask, farmer will say, how can I keep up my rice paddy? Because it's cultural attached to my family. And then they don't give that land for the tree plantation. And second thing, very challenging is cassava is annual crop and is boom in Laos. Farmer prefer to have short return income rather than waiting for 5, 10 years, 15 years. So for me, when asking, and one of my case study also teak, and I asked them, why don't you plant teak and continue teak? Too long for me, and it's not my priority. One of them also say, I'm too old to go tree. So it's very complex in livelihood, in smallholder in Laos. So I would say,
Yeah.
I want to hear the view from you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, we're giving them Eucalyptus pellita, which is heavily bred for rapid growth. And so they're getting a tree crop in 6 or 7 years. But again, it's voluntary. Nobody has to participate in the program. But so far, 400 farmers, I think, have signed up.
Yeah.
Any questions in the back 4 rows? This is true to type. But we'll have one down the okay, Justin, then we'll come down to Patrick, and then we'll wrap up the formal questions.
David, thanks. Love all the integration and the adding value. I just wonder if your optimistic message is still understated, that there's even more potential, the regeneration, like the positive feedbacks of the trees producing the water, the flood mitigation, the oysters, and the future yield in a more resilient landscape will probably be better than the additive benefits of all the parts. And the business as usual, continuing to do sheep and cows and wheat, is probably in a higher risk profile going further. So I wonder if you're just understating it a little bit.
Well, I don't know if you know, but like in Foraco, which was formerly the Guns plantations that we bought, we have 80,000 hectares of natural vegetation that we just manage for conservation. And we have 80,000 hectares of plantation, or maybe 90,000. And so we decided, let's do a natural capital accounting across our assets. And lo and behold, the forestry is worth about $1 billion. In fact, we just sold it for $1 billion. And what they came up with was, things like water, biodiversity, carbon was worth $3 billion. So, that would quadruple the value of the asset. And so like with our forestry coalition, I made a graph saying value to society, value to, the manager. And I tried to draw a line of like those converging. And, that's the holy grail, right? Is that we fully realize in society the value of these natural assets and they become investable.
And then we'll wrap up.
Thanks. It was a great talk, David. So it seems to me, and I imagine you'd agree, is it what you've done is you've just done forestry smarter, right? And that's ultimately good ideas, it's good data. You're getting to a place, I imagine, where you're optimizing, you're pushing the optima there. So this is a big room full of research scientists. I'm curious, what are the, research has underpinned all of this at some level. What are the research issues going forward, or have you sort of figured it out?
No, I think you could see that there's a tremendous amount of work here in conceptualizing these natural assets and how they're described and how, we create the right metrics to track what we want to achieve as an outcome. I think the analytical tools, there's an enormous opportunity there. In fact, I talked to a lot of, sort of startups that are trying to get into this space with, new geospatial modeling tools and so on. It's a very hot area. So I think there's, and I guess as Peter was saying, I endowed a chair in conservation finance at UBC because I think in British Columbia, I mean, that whole industry is just in open collapse. And yet they're like the natural capital of British Columbia is extraordinary and it's valued at nothing. So, let's figure this out because it's going to be one of the big, the hell with Bitcoin. Think about it. Bitcoin's worth $1 trillion. It's probably worth more than the whole planetary ecosystem right now. That's what we have to change. And I think there's a huge opportunity to figure this out.
Thanks. Well, that's a good note to end
Bitcoin.
on. Because I was also thinking, as David was talking, that those of us at the ANU and our financial circumstances that we're experiencing could probably benefit from a bit of a revaluation of assets. That David was talking about, so we'll talk about that over dinner. Can I ask, thank you, David, to ask Director of the Fenner School, Professor Paul Cunningham, just to say thanks on our behalf.
Thank you, thank you, David. Yes, I'd love to give a vote of thanks. I was thinking about the fact that the ANU has a really strong history in plant ecophysiology. Many great plant ecophysiologists here. But with respect, I wouldn't normally ask them for investment advice. And I think you've convinced me that I would trust your investment advice. And more seriously, that that kind of thinking that really, moves beyond just sort of the biology and the ecology that so many of us are strong in and starts to look at the way finance, business and economics constrain what's possible and what's probable is really valuable and important. And I guess the other thing, a measure that I see of the success of the talk was it's really interesting to hear the questions focus on those challenges of integrating land use. I think we all know that land use conflict is one of the huge issues in front of us with most of the solutions on the horizon. So it was great to hear the audience, prompted by your presentation, started to ask questions about what really might be realistic and how do we make these positive things happen. So thank you very much for providing such a stimulating talk.
Thank you.